Hi, welcome to another episode of Django Chat, fortnightly podcast on the Django web framework. I'm Carlton Gibson, joined as ever by Will Vincent. Hello, Will.
Hi, Carlton.
Hello, Will. And this week we've got Chris Adams with us. So Chris, I don't know how quite to introduce you, Chris, but I first saw you at a DjangoCon where you gave an absolutely mind-blowing talk about greening Django and environmental impact of tech and all of these things. So I'm hoping that's what we're going to talk about today.
I think so, but I'll be honest, I'm a fan of the show and I'm quite happy to be on here. So I'm happy to follow your lead. But if we nerd about climate tech and stuff, I'm totally on board with that. That works for me.
Super, good. Well, thank you for coming on. I guess, look, let's get into the climate stuff momentarily because that is just an amazing topic. But we always ask and we want to know, how did you get into Django and what's your backstory? Give us your origin story.
Okay, my origin story when I came into programming, I actually took a bit of a kind of like a artsy media route actually. So I initially studied things like biology, chemistry and maths with the idea of maybe being a doctor or something. I totally got distracted by like photography and like computer games and all these other things in high school. And I ended up getting really into media instead as a result. And I didn't realize you could even study that. So I did that for a couple of years. And then I ended up going to university to do a course called Contemporary Media Practice, whatever that is.
Brilliant, right? Brilliant.
I know. And we ended up doing, I learned all about how to make films with an actual Bolex camera that you wound, like you see people in World War II style movies. Yeah. We did like digital video. And we also did this thing called digital, because it's like, I think early 2001, 2002. So playing around with Flash and stuff, that was my exposure to like computers and things like that. And
okay.
That was kind of going to there. And I ended up I took a very kind of artsy route into this. And at the same time, I was kind of getting interested in the whole notion of people talking about blogging and the whole kind of the closest thing that might have been to a scene, I suppose, around this in London back in the early 2000s. And I got involved in things like digital civil liberties. And as a result, I ended up a lot of the kind of artistic practice went into that. So I ended up working on a couple of wacky projects. So we would do things like make films or do photography projects. But the thing that I did for my final year project was basically build what you might recognize as something that looks a bit like a Russian dash cam these days, but with an insurance process built into it. So it was designed as a kind of like comment about the whole kind of like startup tech scene, I suppose, partly because we had a lecturer his name was Richard Barbrick, and he taught us all about this. There was a particular course called Media Freedom. So we talk about who owned media and things like that. And so you learn a little bit about what kind of privacy laws were and what laws were tied to things like, say, copyright and stuff. And the thing I realized when you're looking through this was that there was a load of really interesting and, I don't know, quite like pressing now, I suppose, discourse about like the impact of tech on society and stuff. And we ended up building like this dash cam with the idea that we would create a kind of like faux mock startup around this with the idea that, what's the best way of describing it? Maybe I should step back to talk about where I lived at the time, because that might help. So I used to live in a pretty rough part of town, and generally when you were driving, you wouldn't want to like beep at someone or something like that because there was a lot of aggro around there. And we end up at the time I used to live with my mum because I was quite young, and I'd see her get really frustrated with this. So I basically built a tool which was literally like a little Linux box. This is for my art project, by the way, that run on the cigarette lighter in the car, was hooked into a kind of cheap webcam and a USB dongle and a big fat guitar pedal that you could like hit. And the idea was you'd be driving around, and when someone cuts you up, instead of like screaming at them and endangering your life, you'd pull over and just like mash this button like, oh God, I can't believe I'm so angry. And then by the time you get home, it'll take that video, upload it into the cloud, and then basically send do some number plate recognition and then expose that as a feed to the person's insurance company. So they get priced off the road for driving like a terrible person. And the idea behind this was that, okay, this is an idea around, this is the direction we're going to be heading towards. And we built this, and we thought this was actually an awful thing to build because everyone thinks it's above average, right? So this was it was start as a kind of like artistic statement. So after building this, we figured, well, there's an idea called things like prior art, right? So what we did was we as because I was an art student, I basically open sourced all this, and then we showed it literally in an art gallery. So it's literally prior art to make it really, really hard to patent. And from there, I kind of got into like, I guess like artsy, techie stuff from there, because it seemed like just a really interesting field to be working in. And that was kind of what I wanted to work in from that's kind of what got me into tech, I suppose. Yeah.
That's a great opener, because I didn't have you down as like a founding person in surveillance.
Well, I was the Open Rights Group in the UK. They're a bit like the UK version of the EFF. And I was the first ever intern at org. And I was like designing all their leaflets and things back in the early 2000s as well. Partly, I mean, like the purpose of the art project was deliberately to start a conversation around this kind of stuff. Because it felt like, oh yeah, there's all these words like surveillance, which is like bottom-up surveillance. But at the same time, there's a whole discourse about, okay, who gets to be the people doing this? Anyway, this is a bit of a divergent, but that's kind of how I got into tech and playing with stuff. Yeah.
Okay. And so, well, it's not divergent, it's brilliant. It's exactly what we asked for. But so how did you find Django?
Oh, okay, so...
did you find Django?
This is where the tribal stuff happens. So when I was initially working with that, that was roughly around Rails was starting to become like this cool thing. And in my final years at university, I was like we didn't really do much, like the coding we did do was like Dreamweaver and ActionScript or stuff. And I kind of bought a book like Agile Web Development with Rails. And I was like, a guy who was working with me, he was a bored cognitive science student who thought, Chris, the stuff you're doing sounds more interesting than the stuff I'm doing. So I'll help you on your digital project because it sounds like a laugh. Yeah. So he did all the kind of crunchy C stuff and like learning with servers. And I tried to do some of the front end design bits. And that was Ruby on Rails. So I learned a bit from there. And then after graduation, I got on really well with this guy. His name is Fred Fix. We set up a company together. And we said, we're only going to work on wacky open source, make the world a better place, techie stuff. And so I defaulted to doing, again, like front end stuff when he did a bit of like Rails. And then the space we're in, there was another agency who'd been doing a bunch of Django work. I think it was like 0.96 back then. And like you share an office, and I was like, oh, what are you doing? Oh, that sounds cool. What are you doing? Oh, we do this. Is there any chance you could help us out? Because I can see you guys can code. And like my friend Fred, he could code in Python, and I could do some front end. So I got my first exposure to Django back in 2008, Django 0.96, only working in the front end, whilst I was working with other people who did all the back end. And this was before we had like migration. So people would like scream like, hey, we're going to change the databases. Can you like paste this SQL file to like, we had all that horrible stuff. So that was my way into Python and Django. So that was like 2008. So, oh my God, that does age me, doesn't it? Wow. Yeah.
Was that templates, or are you dealing with an API from Django?
I was mainly working at the template level, because the thing I really liked as someone working with the two was that it felt very, very comfortable for me. Whereas when I did the equivalent back then, working in Rails, I had to learn all these other bits of it felt very much more kind of opinionated around Ruby. So I was doing front end stuff really. And from there, I did a bit more kind of Python work. And then I think my first proper Python project I went from there to working in Twisted, which I found extremely difficult because, well, yeah, there's asynchronous stuff and all this event-based stuff, which was, oh God, really hard for a media studies student to get their head around, or at least this media studies student to get their head around.
Yeah. That just is hard.
I mean,
that just is hard.
Andrew Godwin says it's hard, so I believe him. So on that front, I love that project though, because that's that. Yeah. When people email me about my books and stuff and the projects they want to build, often it's something like that. It's like, well, I want to have a back end and an API, and I want this, and I want this, and I want this, and it just sounds like impossibly complicated to me. But I'm thinking about how to actually build it, as opposed to like, yeah, well, you could, and you just step by step through it. So I love that. It's like you're not constrained by like, that sounds hard. It's like, oh, like it's tech, like it could be done. It can be done, right? You just got to find the tools and work backwards to the end goal.
Yeah, in this case, I was extremely lucky to have someone who was both bored and really, really, really good at computers, who kind of would help me. So I came up with like the name and like the general like wacky concept. In the end, we called it grassroots, as in like you would grass someone up en route to somewhere. Like that was kind of it was like a multi-layered kind of artsy pun stuff.
You had to explain it, yeah.
That's a very arty pun.
So we had a bunch of stuff like that. So yeah, that was it. It was you don't know what you don't know, so you could have jump in, and when you're like that young, you don't need to sleep as much as you might do now when I'm like closer to 40. So yeah, it was it was a learning experience, and in some ways fun, I suppose.
Yeah, closer to 40. Yeah. I mean, I got to tell you, I just turned 40 this year, and Carlton can attest. It's all, you're just picking up momentum.
I'm just getting further away constantly now.
Yeah, well, it's like my grandfather used to say, to be 85 because he lived to 99. Okay. You know.
Wow.
Okay, right. So that's your start, but then that's still a long way. So you've kind of got into building apps, building web applications in the early 2000s. Common thing to happen. But then many years later, not many years later, probably 10 years later, I saw you, or 8 years later, I saw you giving a talk about environmentalism. So what's the transition into?
So the transition has largely been, I guess I've been following the subject and having to pick up the tech along the way for most of the things. So I ended up me and my friend Fred, we set up a company, did that, and then we didn't really know how to manage like expectations, the commercial side, all these other things, and doing all these wacky projects. Like another one we did was access control for a co-working space. So with a bunch of open source software written in Python, the twisted thing. So we built a daemon called DoorD, which would make the door could work back and forth, right? And it would read like RFID cards. And the idea being that when you walk in, it would check against an LDAP directory, but also it could play your theme music, or it could play any kind of MP3. So
and entrance music. I actually had that. I had that very same idea, like where I did my graduate study. We had all these rooms, and I was like, people would come in late, so they put you in groups, and I was like, oh, that we all need to have our theme music.
Yeah. I can't remember what it was now, actually.
Because if you ever, probably both of you haven't, but if you see an American baseball game, when the batters come out, they all have theme music. So that's sort of and like a lot of times it's just something generic, but often they have fun with it, especially here in Boston with the Red Sox. So they'll just play ridiculous things. So they actually have entrance music every time they come out. It's like a 15-second little clip as they, grab their crotch.
Oh wow, that's pretty cool. I didn't know that happened. So that was so answer the question, Carlton. That was me doing a bit of Python stuff, and I learned basically why it's not a good idea to put a Linux box connected to a building onto the public internet with SSH access, right? Like there were like we have people saying like, hey, why is your door sending me spam? Right? Because you had like things like that we realized. But anyway, that's another story. So I went to bits of like Python, and then after doing that for a while, me and Fred, we kind of like decided to wind up that work. And then I took a job at an agency at an agency called Headshift, where I was working as an operations person, because in all this stuff here, I gradually learned basically all these difficult, painful lessons on my own money on how not to run servers. And then by then I kind of had enough scar tissue to kind of work in that. So I ended up working as a kind of like junior operations analyst, system administration, dog's body person. And then in about 6 months, I ended up being moved into, I think, like consulting, basically. So I ended up being the person to, lead on as a kind of solutions architect-y kind of person, largely because I could talk to humans and talk about technology at the same time. And that was useful.
That's a nice niche to have, right?
Yeah, so we did that, and then ended up working on like a number of projects and having to kind of hire teams to get that stuff done. So there's a bunch of like Drupal projects and WordPress projects, and then like bits of Chef, DevOpsy stuff. And then there were some projects which I didn't really like working on, partly because of technology choices. And I basically said, look, if you put me in another one of these projects, I will quit. And they put me in another one of those projects, and I quit. And so I ended up moving to another company, what was called AMY, that stood for Avoid Mass Extinction Engine, which was one of the companies I'd idolized when I was younger. And they were basically trying to work out the carbon footprint of everything. And I was working as a Rails developer for them. So my first work as like a Ruby coder. And then I worked with them for like a year and a half. And I saw what changes when VC companies, when companies raise too much VC and then realize, oh God, now we're going to have to monetize or figure out how to make back the returns inside 3 years or so. So I did that. And then after 18 months, I basically decided to go off on my own again as a kind of independent consultant. And at that same time, a friend of mine who had been doing a bunch of Django work, he was like, Chris, there's this one project, this called Demand Logic, which is turning into a proper company now. Can you help me out? Because I know that you've gone freelance recently. So I basically did that. I ended up working with him, and then we did a kind of transition process. And that was me going back into working with Django again, back after 2008. And it was really nice because I had a background with Rails by that point. And then I really appreciated lots of the ideas that were also implemented in Django. And there was lots of things that I really liked that I didn't see, like the whole kind of notion of forms in Django is really, really lovely. And that was something that wasn't so well developed in Rails for a long time. And then I ended up staying with Python because I found the explicitness much easier for me to kind of keep inside my head. And then ended up working on that, and then ended up, I think, proposing ideas to conferences because I figured we probably should be talking about climate, given that we're in a climate emergency. And you will listen to kind of fellow travelers or trusted messengers. So this seemed like a way to do that. And also I really liked the kind of Django community back from like the PyCon days back in 2008. So I ended up thinking like, well, if I'm going to join one community, Django seemed like the nicest and a really nice community. And where did we speak? I can't remember. Was it in Denmark or was it in Italy?
It must have been Italy. Must have been Florence that I first saw you. And it just blew me away because you were like, because obviously climate change had come on the agenda. But I didn't know anything about it really. And, okay, we've got to stop using cars and we've got to, I don't know, we've got to stop. But you were like, no, look, you can choose to put your servers, you can have greener servers and you can spin down some servers when you're not using them and you can massively reduce the carbon footprint of your project. And actually this is doable. And it's like, it's doable for you on the projects that you work on to try and consult this with. And I was just like, wow, that is amazing. And then obviously I talked to you afterwards and I was like, wow.
And that was your first DjangoCon, Carlton, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, that was my first. That was an amazing DjangoCon. I went to Florence. Well, because I'd been in the Django, using Django forever, but just sort of, and I've been contributing to Django REST Framework for ages. But I was kind of like, just goes to codes type thing. I was on the mailing list, but that was about it. And I'd never been to a DjangoCon or a PyCon or any of these things. And then I went to DjangoCon Europe because it was in Florence, and I went, I'm going there. That sounds amazing. And I was just blown away by, the talks and the people and just everything. I've been like, why haven't I been coming to this for years? It's just absolutely the most foolish thing in the world to miss DjangoCon. Anyway, that was how
we met, Carlton, right? You came to my talk and you very politely after the talk pointed out a couple things I had wrong. Because I would have raised my hand in the Q&A. Probably, hopefully not now, but I was like, wow, that was really, and also I was like, wow, this is like a maintainer, this is like, like in Tron, it's like a user, and he's coming up and talking to me. So it personalized everything. I did want to, so just, we can jump.
Hang on.
I was going to jump around. Go ahead, finish the thought.
No, I just wanted to, before we move on and go deeper into that sort of stuff, I really do want you to, educate us here, Chris. But I just wanted to ask, switching back to Django from Rails, what was the things you missed? Like, there's lots of things that Django does right, but what was Rails has this and that's really nice that we don't have in Django?
This is going to sound quite strange, but the thing that I appreciated there being an abundance of in Rails was actually the tutorials, the really high quality videos and educational support material so that you could be a few days ahead of being found out, right? And the other thing that was actually quite nice was that I found the Rails guides documentation absolutely stellar. And when it was probably because I had 10 years difference between these two. Yeah. But I found that when I was first coming to a lot of the kind of Django documentation, I wasn't able to make so much sense of it because I wasn't so confident in Python at the time. Yeah. Whereas with the Rails stuff, I found it a bit easier for me to like copy and paste and kind of get to a sense of confidence, I suppose. So those are some of the things that I found. And I guess one other thing that was a really big thing, which I really appreciated in Rubyland, was a CLI tool called Pry, which it made messing around on the command line like you would with using IPython or Rich. It made it really nice, and it gave you a really lovely experience. And it took a while for me to find some things like that. But I think those are the main things. That and the testing, and back in, I guess, like early 2010s, was the confusion around what testing tools to use. There wasn't like Rails and RSpec in this. I mean, Rails had RSpec and a few very, very clear things. Whereas in Python, I was like doing a bit in Nose, doing a bit of PyTest, doing a bit in something else. I mean, that feels like it's bedded down a lot more now. But I found myself a bit confused at that stage.
Yeah, I think I can buy into that last point, certainly. Like, should I be using Nose? What's so good about it? Like, how is it any different from what, there's just no guidance there.
I think that's true what you said about Rails with the beginner friendly. That's certainly the case. I mean, in part because I think Django's docs are really good, but in terms of official tutorials, there's Django Girls. Polls is, I mean, it's an interesting thing because I have my own stuff, and I would just as soon take like the very beginner stuff and be like, well, here's three, here's an official hello world, here's an official CRUD, but the docs are, I'd probably, like, someone should do that, and like I could do that, but it's like, it's the polls tutorial is sort of this almost like original source, and no one's really written those things. So I feel like which is to say, I think it would be stronger for Django if there were more than one official tutorial, and probably I'm positioned to make something happen on that front, but there's this like hive mind of Django I and someone else haven't. But I think having, because right now people go to polls and they sort of get, they probably get confused unless they've done something web before, and then they go to Django Girls, or maybe they find my stuff. But in terms of Django itself, would probably be stronger to have some, more tutorials as opposed to just docs.
I think once you're right. Once you're in, you appreciate the extensiveness of the Django docs. But when you're working your way in, it is a little bit more difficult. And like, to be honest, I really think that, okay, you think how much a typical Django developer gets paid, all right? And then you think about how much it would cost to hire like an editor, like someone who's actually got specialist skills in this field. Like, I kind of feel like these are things that it's a case of us deciding to allocate some funds to have people with the correct expertise to do this stuff, and maybe with a different perspective than what we might have, because a lot of us are really comfortable with them, and we're coming from a different place of people who are just coming to this for the first time. So I think there's something like that.
Probably, I mean, Carlton, you've been working with someone on Google Summer of Docs.
Yes, we had the season of Docs project last year, which was good, and we restructured the beginning of the contributing guide, and there's a bit more work to go on there to make it more. But like, that was a nice thing. But I think there's room, I think, for a full-time, not full-time, but like a professional, what they called professional technical writer to be funded to do a much more substantial amount of work on the Django docs. I think it is the introductory level, because the reference level, it's perfect, but those tutorials and how-to levels, they're not quite as rich, for simple reason. It's really hard to write those and time consuming. And
I can attest to that. I mean, on some level, it should just I already give away the first like few chapters of all my books. Like, this is me being incredibly biased, but like, you want something like that, like kind of just copy and paste it over. But I can't do that because I'm on the board. I'm conflicted. Someone else should come in and write something like that. But Django Hello World, Django CRUD, maybe Django Auth, something. And the issue is, I mean, we've talked about this in the show, is the Django board is volunteers, and it's small, and like, already, just speaking personally, I'm doing way too much right now. It's unsustainable how much I'm doing for the board, and I think Anna is probably the president in the same boat. So there just needs to be a way to do that. But I think it would help Django, and to have, beyond just Django Girls, to have those. We probably could even, we had Eva from the Python Software Foundation. There are grants available probably to do something like this, but someone needs to, do all that work to make it happen, is the thing. But maybe someone listening can have a suggestion, because I think, and even for me as an educator, I prefer teaching intermediate stuff than the beginner stuff. I mean, I think it would be stronger for the very beginner stuff to be within Django itself, as opposed to having to go to a third party like me and the other few authors out there. Because even for us, like, someone yesterday was telling me, he was like, yeah, you content creators make all this money. And I was like, are you being sarcastic? Because I can't tell via email, but it's, I love doing it, but like, I take a discount over just being an entry-level Django developer to do my stuff. So I think that's part of the issue. So anyways, long way of saying, yeah, Django should do that. And there's probably funding to have a technical writer, write up those things to kind of match Rails and friendliness for beginners. Anyways.
Right. So.
Oh, I wanted to ask you, yes,
Chris.
Wait, the environment.
Yeah. Before we go, the environment.
Yes.
Quick.
Well, so from where you sit, what do you think, like, when you see Bitcoin, is this just like a doomsday engine in terms of like creating a virtual currency to like use up insane resources and not really do anything? Like, what is your take on it?
I think this is the thing I have really, like, whenever we talk about tech, everyone goes, what do you think of Bitcoin?
I'm such a cliche.
As soon as you start talking about Bitcoin, there's like, there was a phrase called RIP your mentions when you talk about Bitcoin. Right. Because how people, have you ever seen that kind of meme where people are, say, it's got Apu from The Simpsons diving in front of someone with like Elon Musk and valid criticism and weird nerds on the internet, right? You have the same thing with Bitcoin. People get really, 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 really emotionally invested in it, such that if you say anything against it, it's very difficult to have any kind of meaningful, kind of informed discussion around it.
But
now,
we can. This is our podcast. No one's going to talk.
Yeah. We don't.
This is true.
We don't have live comments, so you've got at least.
This is true. This is true.
It's a one-way forum.
Watch. If we get comments, it will absolutely be about Bitcoin. If I start talking about Bitcoin,
yeah, right? Okay.
All right. So generally, I think that there are much better uses of all the compute and the resources and everything like that. And I kind of feel like if you really care about the decentralization aspect of it, then you should be able to decouple the notions of decentralization from proof of work. Because the proof of work part, which basically creates scarcity when there needn't be scarcity, not just in compute, but also now in kind of bandwidth, because there's kind of tokenization of bandwidth and tokenization of storage with Shia. Every single fundamental building block we use to create digital services to make the world better, there are tools and there are various schemes which essentially create scarcity when there needn't be. And that pushes up the costs onto literally everyone else to enrich a small number of people. I find that problematic, but this is if possible, it'd be really nice not to talk about Bitcoin for the podcast.
Okay,
I think there are other people who do a much better job of talking about it. And there's we can talk about. Basically, I think it's really easy for me to get on a high horse and start talking about it, and then suddenly the hour's over, and I'm like, and another thing.
Yeah.
And I feel like,
well, let's talk about climate and Django.
Well, tell us about the
climate and Django's history.
Yeah, tell us about the Green Web Foundation, the Green in Django talk that you did. Like, give us your.
Yeah. Okay. So the one thing you mentioned, Carlton, when you saw that talk in 2017, was you felt like, oh wow, there is a way that this can speak to my, I guess, things I value as a professional and as ideally like a responsible technologist, right? And I can see the way I see it, like if you're over the age of like say 18 and you considered an adult, we're kind of heading into like, we're literally in a climate emergency. Like we have, more than half of all the kind of local councils in the UK and lots of places around Europe and in America saying, hey, we need to do something. You see all these things. And I kind of feel that we tend not to talk too much about this as technologists because we don't really have the language for using this. And I feel that it's kind of what should be part of your part of what you consider being a professional is to be aware of these changes and avoiding and take steps to avoid needless harm if you are in a position of power when you can make these decisions. And that's kind of how I framed it for the Django talk specifically, because I kind of feel having a sense of control over your own destiny is really important, and that's why I think lots of people respond nicely to the kind of climate Django talks, because they're like, oh wow, there's things I can do. I'm no longer powerless. And I think there was also something interesting at that conference, is that later on, someone was saying, well, I'm just a developer, what can I do? And I kind of feel, well, that's like saying I'm just someone who gets paid multiples of the median salary in my place, where I'm able to pick and choose my jobs and able to basically dictate the extent of how I work, such that things like 20% time are a thing, or if I get severance, it's 6 months of severance rather than being fired on the spot in many cases. And I feel that, like, yeah, if we're professionals, then we should be able to, I guess, rather than just kind of like feel bad about this weird kind of dissonance between what we do professionally and what's happening around us, it makes more sense to align these ways. And there are ways to align this stuff. And I think that's a more healthy way of thinking about this. And also, I think if you can frame the stuff that you do in these terms, then I guess it makes you like more fulfilled as a technologist. But in many ways, the things that you might value as someone who cares about, I guess, us moving to an advanced and humane future are the same things you'd value as an engineer, like, avoiding needless waste, avoiding needless harm. Yeah, all this stuff here, right? And it often makes you look like a rock star if you're able to, I don't know, halve the bills of things you're at or something like that. I mean, rock star in a good way there.
No,
but you know what I mean.
But exactly, like, because as well, there is this thing that if you are more efficient, you do cut the bills. And so you can say, well, we can just keep these servers on full time, and they can be going full blast 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. Or, just on the weekends when we get no traffic, we could scale down to just have one of them going, so that, if someone turns up, the site's still up. But, we don't need 4 servers running full capacity on the weekend because we don't get any traffic.
And like, this is actually, I think this is why I talk a lot about the aesthetics of this. And like, I worked with some friends to make a magazine called Branch.
Okay.
Like, nerdy sustainability tech gag there, but it was specifically to make kind of like climate tech seem exciting and interesting and the thing that you want to aspire towards. And I kind of feel that when I didn't actually say this before, but one of the reasons I kind of got interested in Django was, I think in the early 2000s, you meet various people, and I think I can't remember where I met Simon Willison, but I heard about Django from him, and like we'd bump into each other, I think some of the open rights group style things. And from that, I met people like Tom Dyson and these people who I really looked up to. And they were very much like, I guess, they had a halo effect for the framework that made me want to go towards that. Because I thought, like, the things that were being built, like Every Block and all these things here, which were about, let's talk about, journalism in terms of, let's address some of these balances of power. These seemed like really cool, important things to do. And I feel I that's kind of where some of this came from. And like, I think this is the other reason why I end up speaking at a lot of the Django stuff, in addition to me being interested in like the framework and everything, is that I feel like there's a kind of, there's something of a kind of climate tradition with Django. I know there are people who have worked on things like this. So the people who I kind of look up to, or had looked up to a very long period of time. So I look at, say, like I would mention like Simon Willison, Andrew Godwin, Tom Dyson, Natalie Down, I think she's Natbat on Twitter. These are the people who all worked at, say, an organisation called Torchbox when they worked on a thing called the Carbon Account, which was like people trying to work out personal carbon footprint stuff back in 2008, and they were using Django to build all this stuff. And now you look at, say, some of the companies that are doing some really, really cool stuff. Like in the UK in particular, there's a company called Octopus Energy. They're one of the fastest growing energy companies. And they also have a really, really lovely style guide, which I can always reference when I'm working on projects. And that's, there's a climate angle there as well. And I kind of feel like, even when I was in Germany where I worked at a company called Thermondo. And like, once we've realized that we need to get off fossil fuels for energy, one of the next problems is figuring out how to heat things, figuring out heating as a problem. And like, they were working on that, which I worked briefly. And again, that's a big Django team. And I kind of thought that like, it makes, Django is a really, really good tool for this, but also a lot of the aesthetics or the people I look up to seem to be associated with this. So I figured, that's a thread. I should probably run with that, because I figure like it would be awesome if Django just became like the obvious choice to build any kind of the next gajillion-dollar climate tech startup or something like that, And it just feels like because you could reach into data science, and because it's so ubiquitous, it feels like it's a really nice place to have leverage, I suppose. And there's a really nice scope for cross-pollination as well. Like there's loads of interesting stuff with, like, say, machine learning, and people have figured out that, yeah, machine learning uses huge amounts of electricity for what it's doing. But there's also responsible scientists and technologists and innovators there. And there's things like codecarbon.io, which is basically a Python context manager that will basically run a process or run something, then tell you what the carbon footprint of that would be. And it's initially used for, like, working out, say, for you to kind of think about how you might change your machine learning run. But this is exactly the kind of stuff you might use to kind of either put into, like, CI or anything that can run a process. Like I can imagine this being tied to, say, anywhere you kind of run a Django process, so you can understand what the environmental impact of that might be, so that you can, like, tune it and do things like that.
It's something I really worry about with the Django project itself, is that we've got so many databases and so many supported versions of Python, and we've got Mac and we've got Windows, and we've got so the big CI run, we run the Selenium test, we run the Oracle test. It's like 20 odd 30 CI runs for every commit. It's like that's
this sounds mild, yeah, but this is like there are ways you can address this problem.
Yeah.
And you can look to what Firefox is doing, because, okay, if Django is complicated, imagine how many... there's a really good post that the Firefox team wrote about how they basically applied machine learning to look at the similarities between all these different kind of similarities in their test matrix, their targets, right? And they basically... Okay, I'm not a data scientist or a machine learning specialist. They did, like, some AI magic to work out which ones tend to be, like, meaningful failures compared to other ones.
Yeah.
And they were able to, like, reduce the CI runs by more than 90%, because, like, if something because, like, say, I think, like, 2 versions of OS 10, like, if one's going to fail in one, then it's probably going to fail in the other one. So there's no point. They were doing some stuff like that, basically. But they were able to achieve really drastic reductions and the use of CI there. And there's all this space for ingenuity and innovation here. And I kind of feel like these are the things that speak to our values as, like, technologists and people who want to be building the future. And I feel like these are the things that would make sense to make consistent with how we feel as, well, what we want to do in our day job, really. And I feel like if we kind of end up building Star Trek instead of Mad Max along the way, this is also a win, right? Like, yeah.
I wonder, I've got the post up, and we'll link to it in the docs. There's a great meme on the not sure a flaky test or broken code, which is very true. I mean, but I almost wonder if we had a list, so if someone wanted to tackle this for Django, like, I almost feel like we should have a list of, like, Millennium problems that someone for Summer of Code or elsewise wanted to tackle, because maybe that's an interesting idea certainly just to say, like, just how long it takes productivity hit as well as an environmental hit to take so much time to run tests.
Well, this is the thing. Like, there is a lot of overlap between these things here. Like, you can talk about, like, efficiency all the time, but it's also important to think about the other things that you kind of value, I suppose, because we can talk about how we. And this is one of the things that kind of, I guess, drew me very much to, like, the Django community, was when I went to the conferences. There was a sense of inclusion and sense of camaraderie and community, and I find that I really found that a real plus. And when I ended up, like, helping at some of the Django Girls things, and I saw how generous people were with their time and expertise, and I thought I definitely really want to be a part of that. And again, I think that there's a lot of ideas that I think we don't celebrate so much or really appreciate quite so much, that we could celebrate more or really kind of make more of a thing of. And I've got to understand, like, just a fanboy of, like, kind of Torchbox and people like this, aren't I? But I kind of feel like we should be, like, when we celebrate, companies doing a big sale, like, or raising a bunch of money or VC or going to an IPO or something. Yeah, that's good and everything. But I think there's also things when we see people decide, like, okay, we're not going to sell on my agency, but I'm going to sell it back to the employees so they can focus on doing really, really meaningful work that might not necessarily be as profitable as other work, but is really vital work. Like, I know that Torchbox did something like this recently, where the founders basically took a step back. And I thought, like, this is the kind of classy move that I wish we would see more of and be celebrating more and be talking about, because I feel like these tie into the ideas of community and things that we seem to like really value when I speak to people at conferences, and it feels like these are things are worth being aware of. In the same way that when you look at, I guess, people working at things like 18F in America or GDS, these feel like things which are also things that we do celebrate, but I feel that we could celebrate more because they are like vitally important services and things which improve the lives of so many people. So yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that ties into thoughts and discussions we've had on the DSF members list about, celebrating contributors to Django that are beyond just the code, beyond, oh, so-and-so did some commits and did this feature on the ORM, which, we don't celebrate enough as it is. But, there's so much more to Django than that. Like all the contributors to, putting on a DjangoCon, we don't call them out. All the people who help at a Django Goals workshop, we don't call them out. All the people who just are there on the mailing list or the forum that we don't call out. And the Django community is so much more than just the repo. And yeah, I mean, to call out cool things in the ecosystem too, it's all part of the same. We need to recognize that what a great community we have here. And,
Well, there's doing the work and promoting the work, right? And most people spend their time doing the work, but it's like, who's going to promote it? I mean, one of the things I hope that comes out of this podcast is introducing people who do fill those roles and calling attention to it, because there isn't an official Django way to say, hey, here's who organizes these conferences, here's who are the people who have done all these things, and this is what they're like. So that's partly, to get to your question of, owner occupied, there isn't really like certainly not a monetization, but there isn't a way for someone or some organization to spend the time to promote things, because that is also a form of work beyond saying, do come to a DjangoCon, do get involved. And once you're in the community, you can experience it, but you sort of have to take that first step to have it. But certainly everyone on this podcast, is big on the Django community. So I think it is the case once you take that first step, whatever it is. In any event, I did want to call out one thing. We have links to your talks. For someone who I wasn't actually aware, I wasn't thinking about this, but the fact that you have a slide saying the internet is the biggest machine in the world and it mostly runs on fossil fuels. Like in the US, I don't even know how much the internet counts for energy consumption, but I think it's like other percentages out there for so how much is the internet versus
there are you can see percentages, and there's two things to remember for this. So first of all, the internet is roughly, you can think of it in terms like if you read all the academic literature, you'll find figures from between 1 and 3% of CO2 emissions and 1% and 5 or 10% of electricity. Now, generally speaking, I kind of feel that the amount of electricity it uses, I'm not that worried in basically I think it's more useful to think of it in terms of what is it comparable to, right? Because this helps us figure out, like, is this a good use of that? Is it a good deal or is it not a good deal? So the internet and like technology in general, it's about 2% of global CO2 emissions. So that's like roughly all of aviation or all of shipping, right? And it's also like the equivalent to if you want to compare it to other things, that's like Canada or Germany, or the increase in emissions from us switching from mainly cars to mainly SUVs is round about the same kind of ballpark, right? So you think about, if I want to have these things, consider all the kind of utility I get from this, I would say 2% of emissions for all the things that digital does to me is actually a pretty good deal, especially in the middle of a pandemic, right? When I think about, switching from cars to SUVs in that same time period and it being the same kind of footprint, I feel that's slightly less of a good deal, right? And I kind of feel like this is why you need to think about what you're comparing it to. And the other thing to bear in mind is that we need to get this to zero, right? So even if it isn't a huge amount, the scale of the challenge ahead of us is that we need to get to zero emissions by, as soon as possible. But most governments are saying the 2050 at the absolute latest. And in America, it's like 50% by 2030. So it's not a case of it just being level, it's having to get down to something like that. And the good news is that technology, assuming you're not going to be doing something silly with proof of work based currencies, right? You can actually, it does feel like you're moving in the right direction. like I'd say tech is actually pretty good for a bunch of this stuff. And if you're going to talk about, you wouldn't necessarily be talking about the environment, the carbon footprint of tech so much as like who are we choosing to enable, and what behavior are we, which needs are we choosing to prioritize? Because these are the decisions that are probably going to have much farther reaching implications. But at the same time, it's kind of a professional hygiene thing to like not be running all your infrastructure on fossil fuels if you can help it, because it's needlessly causing harm.
Yeah.
Like it's something in the order of like 1 in 5 early deaths comes from burning fossil fuels. So even if you don't talk about carbon emissions, there's still all these needless deaths which happen just because we've got this destructive default that we can and should be fixing.
Okay, so there's a good example that you've brought up, running my infrastructure on fossil fuels, right? So, but I go to cloudprovider.com, /provision, and I click my instance. There's no column for renewable power.
This is
Right, I don't. How do I as a developer say, right, I'm gonna provision this cluster using.
All right, so there's a few things
this
which
data
makes
center.
this easier now. So I mentioned codecarbon.io as one example. They do some really cool stuff where they'll basically look at the kind of job that you just did and then say, well, this is what the carbon footprint would have been at all these other regions which we can find on our list of cloud providers. And ThoughtWorks recently have released a project called Cloud Carbon Footprint, which basically will plug into your AWS, Google Cloud, or Microsoft billing tools, and will basically tell you this and say, well, if you are running, this is what the carbon footprint of your job is, of like down to like service level. So you have these figures out there, but it's generally right now only the huge companies provide these kinds of numbers right now, and it feels like there's a real need for other ones because healthy ecosystems are diverse ecosystems. And we had the discussion before about, okay, well, there's also the idea that these are the cloud providers who are very, very efficient, but they're also the people who are the absolute leaders in accelerating the extraction of fossil fuels for it to be burned, which have these problems further down. And right now, we have no way of decoupling the cool stuff from the bad stuff, like accelerating fossil fuels or not paying taxes. And I kind of feel that this is something that we tend not to talk about too much. And I feel like there is something that we can actually address by basically, I think the phrase I used was stacktivism rather than activism, right? Thinking about, okay, well, if you're going to do this, what steps can you take? And like Amazon have been on the record saying, if you care about this, please use the green regions more. And like they are moving, but they're only moving as fast as they really need to. And I also feel that like it kind of feels like, wait, so suddenly the cost of a migration is on me to move all my stuff because you, $1 trillion company, aren't in a hurry to make these changes. And I feel like while we're stuck with no way of moving away from this, I kind of feel it's very difficult to have much leverage. And I feel like this is a thing about us being more strategically aware as professionals about who we're enabling when we do this kind of stuff. Or at least be able to talk about it and say, well, this is a real priority for us. Please do something to do this. Because I'm not saying that we should disengage, but even engaging, I don't think there are that many people who are even engaging at this point or know how to start these conversations.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's going to have to, as you said, it's going to have to come from the consumers who say, this is important to me. And that will feed back, at least to the American companies. They're not, they care about the bottom line. So if customers care, they'll add it, but on their own.
This is the thing. So this is one thing that's kind of interesting for us. And there's loads of really useful research around this. So we often think in terms of this has to come from consumers first. But in many ways, it's much more of a kind of symbiotic thing where let's look at accessibility, for example. Accessibility is another case where there's lots of people who have been previously shut out from services which would improve their lives. And it wasn't necessarily consumers who were able to get this. It was a concerted effort by professionals saying, no, accessibility is important, but also speaking to the people who procure and say, these are the things you need to ask for. Like having something like the WCAG, the Web Content Authoring Guidelines. These make it easy for people who write checks to say, you need to make this accessible, otherwise we're not going to do this work. And like this was initially pioneered by public sector. So, and then this has trickled down to like even Domino's Pizzas having to care about this and private sector companies needing to take this into account where previously didn't have to. And there's really good examples of stuff in public sector where they are working for this. And like, I mean, I speak as a European, right, where I think 45 billion euros is spent on IT each year, which is a pretty big carrot, right? But also in the UK, there's a load of really interesting work where the people who spend money there, like in the orders of hundreds, tens of millions, are also saying, we spend loads of money and we have our own targets that we need to meet. We should be speaking. So it's a case of consumers, but there's also, I think there's a wider, it's more complicated than that. And I kind of feel that, I mean, the really good example actually will be America right now. So America, we've had this massive infrastructure announcement, right, where they're going to spend something like $2 trillion. Now, even Google themselves, Google are like one of the leaders in this in terms of greening their infrastructure, right? So they've said, we want to be 24/7 matching power. So not on an annual basis, they want to have all the time, all their infrastructure running all the time on renewable power. And they said, we're doing this and we are setting a target of 2030 because even us, a $1 trillion company by ourselves, can't do this. We need to work with the government. And the US government have basically included the same language of 24/7 power into all their buildings from now on, right? Now, the biggest buyer of renewable electricity has now said, we're going to do what Google is doing. So that's going to change the market much more than just consumers in this. And I kind of feel like as people who build systems and maintain systems, there's all this useful systems thinking we could draw upon and like expand our understanding of this. And I feel like as professionals, we could totally do this. It's like so much you could like dive into if you're interested.
But as well, and when you're in that next next meeting where it comes to be like, you know, we're going to spec up the architecture. Yeah. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? To raise your hand and mention those points is actually working on the front line here. It's making the changes.
And this is the thing I was going to mention. There's two things on this thing I was going to mention. First of all, we've done some work with the Internet Society and we've landed a bunch of funding to basically build an open syllabus aimed at technologists saying, these are the questions to ask. These are how to think about it. And we're going to be doing it over the next year.
Yeah, okay.
And we'll be running a series of fellowships who we basically hire them to learn in the open with us to build this open syllabus that could be used for pretty much any kind of documentation. But the thing that I wanted to speak to you folks about is that we're considering doing something similar to have like a kind of Green Web Django fellow where we would basically pay, we're thinking of something like between 10 and 15K for someone to basically write the guides and write the information for this. And we can probably we can put up like, I don't know, 7K already because we've had some funding land. So if we can find some other people to put in some of the other stuff, then we can absolutely pay for someone to say, these are the things to think about as a specialist, as a responsible technologist. So just like we have things like the defaults from like Hanger from, I think Jacob, what's Jacob's surname? Do you know Jacobian on Twitter? I forget he's the...
Jacob Kaplan-Moss.
Thank you. Yes, yeah. So one of the places he worked, there is like this document called the defaults, which is this is what we use for our stack, right? All things being equal, right?
Yeah.
It would be so nice to have something like these are the things to think about as a Django developer, because there's stuff out there. There's some work by a guy called Asim Hussain. And I think he's written something called Principles.green, which is basically how to think about architecture as a developer in this field. And he is now the head of green cloud advocacy at Microsoft, who are doing some really good work. There's totally stuff out there, but it'd be really nice to have something specifically aimed at the communities, because in the land of WordPress, there's a bunch of real trailblazers there. And I kind of feel like with Django's background and all the people I've mentioned before, there's absolutely space to have like people saying, this is how we do kind of green Django, or the phrase I've used is gold Django, because there was like green, open, lean, and distributed. That was like the stuff I used in the talk to make it sound cool. So this was based on the idea of POUR, because if you work with accessibility, there's perceivable, operable, understandable, or I think it's understandable, I might be wrong. And I forgot what's the last one, resilient, right? So you have the word POUR, it makes it easy to speak to developers. It's a useful kind of memory aid, but it's also a thing that you can say, this is what I'm asking for. Like, it would be cool to have, I want a golden Django website. You can, so people who commission.
Right, so what's gold?
Green power, yeah. Green inputs, which is basically running computers and making computers. Because computers are sand plus IP, remember, right? Like sand with lots and lots of energy, and then thinking about it, turn unit with computers. So green, open, like open source, open culture, open data. These are really useful. L, lean. So if you're going to emit carbon, and we kind of have to because everything uses energy, at least make it count and don't waste it so much, at least be able to respond. And then distributed, because well, because you don't want to be reliant on just one provider. And there's also, once you understand a little bit more about electricity and how like the underlying things that create a carbon footprint as a technologist, you realize that when things are distributed, you can basically scale up demand in places where there's an abundance of green power and not reliant on elsewhere. And so that's it. Green, open, lean, distributed. Yeah. Okay. And this is that's what I spoke about in Greening Django, the talk for Django Days. And oh yeah, I should probably talk about it now. The keynote for DjangoCon Europe. Yeah. So we'll be speaking about this, and if there's interest, I could probably expand upon that a bit more, because yeah, there is that's the thing that we'll be talking about in a bit more detail. Yes.
I like the distributed on the end of there, because that's like one of the hard problems, right? I've got to make my project able to be.
The thing that's so cool though,
deployed
this
wherever.
Is the thing that's really, really cool around distributed, right? So there's a company called Lancium, and what they do is they basically put a load of data. We used to think of data centers as big box things, a little bit like a kind of big box out of town Walmart, right? It's miles where no one can see it, right? And the energy is really, really cheap, and they spend loads of money and loads of time trying to get rid of the heat in the building to where it's outside, and that has some unfortunate side effects. But there's also, this is like, the heat is a really, really useful thing to actually have. You can do stuff with that. So like there's a whole movement to have much, much smaller data centers in urban places where the heat that is generated ends up being used to kind of help with, say, greenhouses, for example, or something like that, when you take a systemic view. But there are also places where, because we're in a kind of world where renewable energy is increasingly common, and you have these kind of natural cycles, you have cases where if you can get the data centers near where, say, there are solar farms or wind farms, when there are places where they're unable to sell electricity into the grid where it'd otherwise be wasted, you can make use of that, which means that you can have much, much cheaper compute than what you might otherwise pay. So Lancium use this, they take advantage of this, and they end up providing essentially EC style compute for jobs at something like an 80% discount compared to Amazon's own prices, because their entire economies are different to the economics of running a massive big box data center somewhere else. So there's all these things that we're not really aware of yet that we could take advantage of if we think about the distributed part. And that's why I think it's kind of cool, because all this work by people in ML have basically made it easier to be aware of this stuff. So whenever there's anything that we could do which isn't super time sensitive, you can shove it to somewhere where it's going to be way, way, way cheaper and way, way greener, and it'll still be part of your process, but you need to design it from the very beginning, or at least have that. And these are the kind of principles that I think we should be aware of as technologists, because it's just freaking cool, if nothing else, right? Yeah.
So that fellowship will, if there's something out on that, we'll put that in the notes, and certainly the Django News newsletter, we'll put it in there, because I think there'll be a lot of interest in that for sure.
Yeah, it'd be really lovely to have that, because I feel that if we value things, it makes sense to, well, literally value things, allocate funding and time to this. And the only reason that it was possible was that the Internet Society Foundation, who are funding us, they basically said, we want to do something about the environmental footprint of the internet. And we said, well, the problem is people don't quite know what to talk about it in terms of beyond just efficiency. So they said, okay, well, we will fund you and pay $200,000 to fund a series of fellowships to build this kind of stuff. So there is funding out there to do this stuff, and there's absolutely funding in my view to kind of pay for, like, say, people to pay for content designers or the people like that for the documentation for Django, all this stuff here. These are things we value, and I feel like that's worth doing. And I kind of, when I look at how useful the Django framework has been in the community, and how valuable the community has been to us as well, I'm kind of amazed by just, like, it wouldn't take that much to kind of double the funding going to the Django Software Foundation, right? And there's so much you could do with that, right? And if you think about like a day rate of a developer, right? Like, it feels like this isn't that hard to do, really, right? It's just a case of explicitly choosing what we decide to fund and support, I suppose.
Well, we had actually, through this podcast, we had a discussion with Eva from the Python Software Foundation, and I think one of the limiting factors for Django has been, for historical reasons, the idea that we can't pay people and do fellowships. But it seems like that's actually not the case. And we actually had Karen Tracy, who was on the board and at Cactus and written a great book, reached out to Carlton and to me to give us the backstory because the current board wasn't around then. So anyways, I think these things are changing to open things up. The issue for Django is always a kind of a management thing, right? We got to find a working group or someone to lead these things, to service the grants. But there are all these grants out there. And if we're able to do that, we could have people, beyond. So Carlton does a lot of work with the Summer of Code, Season of Docs. There's certainly level steps up in terms of money and features and things that could be added. So we're not limited by that anymore, which I guess is what I'm saying. We're confirming that, but it seems to be the case.
I think the thing to remember with Season of Docs and Summer of Codes is it's very much students. And so, there's a limit to what can be achieved within the scope of those programs. But, it's always been the case with Django. Well, we could go out and raise more money, perhaps. We, ask companies that are using, come on, to contribute. But what for? The fellowship program runs, and then beyond that, we didn't have anything to raise the money for. But if there's a super project to raise the money for, then we could all jump on the bandwagon and shout from the things. I'm sure companies will contribute.
I think there's space for stuff like this because I think I remember, was it the work with? I think was it the work on Django channels. I remember there's at least been one thing that's been kickstarted to actually get to create some kind of
Postgres too.
Postgres. There was a REST framework Kickstarter.
Yeah. I think it's a case of us as a community learning to think in terms of public goods and what things are useful and how this stuff can be funded, because there is now an appetite for people to talk about this, and even funders are looking to work out what language people use for this. And in some cases, it may be the case of learning to speak the language of these people, of a funder, or even how people think about governance of this stuff. So I've heard people talk about things like data, there's critical infrastructure, which we're aware of, like buildings and bridges and things like that. But in the UK, people talk about data infrastructure as a way of talking about like addresses or energy data or things like this. And in some other places, I've heard people talk about code as like logical infrastructure, as in the stuff that we rely on.
Yeah.
And I think it's a case of, I think that came from the low risk project who used this term, which I thought, that's kind of nifty. And I think we need to be able to talk about these things that society is increasingly built upon. And if we're able to use that language, it becomes possible to fund this kind of stuff, or it makes it much easier to think about this. It's just that we probably don't have, I guess it's a case of being open to figuring out how to frame it or how to speak the language of people who are prepared to fund this stuff or are looking to fund this stuff. Because right now, they're not quite sure what to do in many cases.
Yeah, no, but that's exactly the problem I have as a sort of interested. I try and cut, be efficient at home and all these kind of things, but I don't really know what to do.
And that's a case of specialization. There are people who are really good specialists at this. So let's say if there's someone who specializes in grant fundraising, I don't know. This is something we've been considering at the Greenwood Foundation. Speaking to someone, because I've tried writing funding applications, and oh my god, it's like pulling teeth, right? Sometimes it works, and so it worked this time, but it's taken so many other times, and it's like, oh my god, it's taken so much time. It's not, like when you're a back-end developer and you do that CSS, and you're like, this is not the most effective use of my time, right? I kind of feel like there is scope for us to kind of realize there are all these other functions which are absolutely real deep domains, and being able to tap into people for that would make so much sense. We're going to try this because it makes sense now that for the first time we can afford to. But it would be lovely to see this kind of maturity, I suppose, expanding, because I really, really am kind of quite emotionally invested in the Django community now. And also technically, because a bunch of the infrastructure now uses Django at the Greenwood Foundation. And that's another podcast, right? But I kind of feel like there is an urgency around this. And it would be cool to have a gold, something like. Anyway, I realised we've gone a bit over time, so I'm going to wind up because I'm a bit of a talker.
I was just thinking this is why the conferences and in-person things are so great, is because you can have, we could have this conversation over dinner, and then things could happen, and things are a bit limited. But structurally, I think something there's room for, more groups within Django to work on these things, but there's a reason why there's professionals who do this stuff. But if we have, because it's chicken and egg, if we know these are the problems we have on the one hand, and then these are the groups that are looking for ways to give money, it's just a matter of putting that together. In any case, so we will have links to everything on here. This will come out in June. You're keynoting DjangoCon Europe, which I think will happen before then. So we'll have a link to, I think they'll have the videos up. So we'll put your talk up when this comes out.
Yeah, no, really.
Oh, guys, I really enjoyed this, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I love seeing your talk. It's so, that's the privilege of having the podcast is, people were like, wow, that person's really interesting. And then we get to meet virtually. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. Oh.
Carlton, you want to read us out?
Yeah, I'm just blown away. I'm just thinking about all these things that we've been talking about. So Chris, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for joining us, everybody. We're Django Chat on Twitter, DjangoChat.com. Yeah, DjangoChat.com, Chat Django on Twitter. Join us next time.
Bye-bye.